question?
I guess this question should have been for you two, not Frank. I haven't read any of the books, so let me preface with that. I'm also not a doctor. I do fancy myself an Aristotelian. I like the idea of final causes. I think they're all over the place. I don't have a problem with the idea of a human telos. But then I find myself agreeing almost entirely with Frank. And so that makes me wonder just how the issue of whether there's a distinction between killing and letting die hooks up with this question of whether there's a human telos. Frank prefaced his remarks with, look, I think there's only one kind of cause. But he could have not said that. His entire argument didn't make notion of the idea of four causes and there only being one. So I guess I just don't see how they hook up. I mean, one way you might think they hook up is if you have a very particular conception of the human telos, and you think it's just part of the human telos that being killed is at odds with it, but being allowed to die isn't. But beyond that being, maybe stipulative, I take it your argument, from what I gather, is meant to be broader, that it's because we lack the concept of a human telos anymore that we become susceptible to arguments like Frank's. But it seems to me that everything depends on what you think the human telos is. So if you think that it's, if you're a Kantian, or you think that it has to do with rationality or something like that, I mean, you're dealing with someone who persists in a vegetative state, it seems like the human telos there is not at all undermined by being killed. So I guess I'd just like to hear more about that.
Can you repeat your question?
Oh, no.
He asked me what I was having for dinner.
And why?
And why, yeah.
How are you going to eat?
Yeah. I guess the question should be framed this way. There seems to be that we might be able to name material pretty distinctly and effects pretty distinctly, but teli are multiple. Yeah? And I think, so it depends on how you narrate that telos in order to then add any sort of meaning to material or efficient causes. And I think that's, okay, yeah, that's right. So in other words, I would say that there are multiple teli. Absolutely. There are cultures that are, and the way I end the book is by asking this question. Might it be that only theology can save medicine? And let me tell you what I mean by that. Meaning and mechanism get wedded up in religious understandings of the world. Those are communally derived. I completely agree with that point. But the meaning and the mechanism, the purpose and the mechanism, are tied together in a certain way. That means that there will be multiple theologies and multiple ways that medicine gets carried out. We want this grand universal narrative of medicine that says the body is this way, and we can say this is true at all times and in all places, in all physiological circumstances. And I want to say that the human dimension to that, we abstract the meaning and purpose as docs in order to measure and quantify and do all of that. But I want to say for any particular patient, and probably for those of us who actually practice, those are actually integrated together. So that what I'm saying is that we need richer metaphysical, moral, and those are historical, those are cultural. For those of us who believe in a God, it has something to do with that, right? So I'm not denying that. I'm just saying that gets folded in. There's Hannah Arendt said something to the effect, I went back and reread it. I must have interpreted her as saying what I'm about to say she said, because she didn't actually say it this way. The human animal is the animal that both produces and is produced by culture. In other words, our meaning and our purposes and our bodies are actually shaped by meaning and purpose. And that goes all the way to neuroscience. You believe that you should bow down before God. You start to practice. You get into those practices, and then your neurocircuitry is shaped by that. Your body is shaped by it. So in other words, it's a lot more complicated than what this kind of superficial metaphysics of just efficient and material causes argues for. So I would say that, yeah, multiple ways of narrating that telos, and that is not independent of the material.
My question is actually directed to Dr. Miller. And forgive me, I haven't read your book, so this might be covered in it. But I was just curious, I guess one disturbing thing, although logically I had to agree with your argument, one disturbing thing for me is that might we impose a normative structure in which certain lives are considered not worth living by allowing direct physician killing. Because both examples you gave were people who became disabled within the course of their life versus individuals who might be born with a baseline function that some would consider intolerable.
Well, I think that's a good question. Yeah, I mean the question is, I think that see, how can I frame this? That won't some people kind of feel that their lives are not worth living because they have these options to cause their own death. You know, when you have options, it certainly changes the reality which you're faced with. But we're talking about, I think that we should be interested in, helping disabled people function first and foremost, and to live satisfactory lives. And so disability, profound disability, does not make one's life in any objective sense not worth living. But those patients who find in their condition after deliberation and careful thought that they would rather die rather than to continue living, I think we need to provide those kinds of options. We already do with withdrawing life-sustaining treatment. So I'm simply trying to work from the logic of the practices that we already have. And that, I think, is kind of the bigger challenge here, is the idea that withdrawing life-sustaining treatment merely allows the patient to die from the underlying condition. I think just doesn't really hold up.
Just briefly, it picks up on both, I think, these questions. What strikes me about Frank's argument is that he shows that in both cases the action is an efficient cause of death of the patient. And he's right. But he moves from that to, he seems to put weight on that because he moves from that to, see, there's no bright line. But it's clear, I think it's pretty obvious that the case of withdrawing life support is not a formal or a final cause of death. It's not, or maybe it's not, but if you think about it, if you think about the giving of the injection, it's called a lethal injection because the very structure of the act causes death. It wouldn't be a lethal injection if the person didn't die, right? So it's a formal cause of death. Final cause of death, and that if you give a lethal injection and the person doesn't die, it's hard to imagine you saying, I did not fail. It's hard to say, well, no, that was, I gave a lethal injection and they're still living. How could that act have achieved its intention? That's not true for withdrawing with a ventilator. So it seems to me that essentially the argument in itself, moving from showing they're both efficient causes to there's no moral difference, suggests that formal and final causation are considered not morally relevant, which is what Frank agreed to, if I understood it correctly.
So I had a question for Dr. Miller again. You talked about with spinal cord injury, for example, that there's this waiting period, there should be a waiting period, and you're not sure, maybe it's 2 years, and that we have this negotiated idea of the good. And I guess what I wanted to know is, given your argument, what justifies the waiting period from your point of view? Because it seems to me like if efficient causation is the only thing that matters, then you're sneaking in, or you might be trying to sneak in some other cause or some other good that's not explicit in your argument. Like, why should we have a negotiated, if suffering and autonomy are the critical things that we need to pay attention to, and there's nothing else besides efficient cause, then why should we have a negotiated agreement, and why should we even make the patient wait? If they want to do it now, they should be able to do it now, unless there's some other cause that we're not thinking about or not making it explicit.
I think the reason is that, the patient may be making a premature decision that's not really consistent with their more settled preferences and values. They've just gone through a very traumatic state, and they may not be able to imagine that their life could be worth living. not being able to move or not being able to breathe on their own. But we actually know from surveys that people with spinal cord injury who are ventilator dependent judge their lives to be worth living and have high quality. We already know that. And so I think it's important for the patient to know that. Indeed, it would be a good idea for that patient to talk to other people who are in the same situation. So I think it's really important both that we respect the autonomous choice, and two, that this is an informed and carefully deliberated choice. At the end of the day, I don't think you can force someone. It would be wrong to force someone to be a prisoner of mechanical ventilation when, after very careful and serious deliberation, maybe ethics consultation, the whole works, they decide they want to do it. But I think it's not desirable because they're not really in a situation yet. I think to make a really well-informed choice. Now, we don't have any idea what that waiting period is, but since you have to undergo a rehabilitation process and there's an adjustment process, it certainly makes sense to try to encourage the patient to wait for a substantial period of time. And I think that's part of the negotiation we make in the context of shared decision making.
To follow up on that, why isn't that judgment that we can determine what other people think in similar circumstances and give you social scientific methods? Why should that be finally normative for all people under similar circumstances? I mean, isn't that going back again to what we're criticizing here as determining medicine?
Yeah, I don't think it's finally normative. It's just something that I think we ought to take into consideration as a guide, that other reasonable people who have gone through the experience, see themselves as having a life worth living. And so it seems to be very useful information that you provide to the patient, along with encouragement and support. I mean, I think the burden of proof ought to be on going forward. I mean, I think we have very good reason to think that people do find their lives worth living, and that a temporary choice that may not be a well deliberated and considered choice. I don't see any difficulty making that consistent with patient autonomy.
Dr. Miller, I had the pleasure of actually reading and reviewing your book, and I want to sort of turn up the dial a little bit on the dispute between you and Dr. Bishop. In particular, in the beginning of your book, you talked about the efficient causal chain between an action and its terminus, meaning the death of the patient, as something that ought to be thought of as in a demoralized way. And in fact, the moralized approach to causal chains is precisely what the problem is, which caused all of this confusion about the difference between killing and letting die. Whereas I gather what Dr. Bishop is arguing is that, in fact, not only is there an important additional distinction to be made with regard to final causation, but you cannot actually disentangle. That is, he specifically disputes your point that those can be separated and set aside, that you cannot disentangle but efficient from final causation, and that, in fact, the attempt to do so is, in fact, a substantive, contentful view about final causation. So Jeff's argument, I think, and I'll let him make it, is that you can't possibly say that you don't believe in final causation. You, in fact, do, and you have a substantive view of it, which is that it should be set aside.
Well,
could you repeat the question?
it's a multifaceted question, and I would be, I'm not really in a good position to repeat it, but I will respond to this question of whether I believe in final causation. I certainly believe that we have purposes, and people establish purposes. That's the only kind of purpose that makes any sense to me. I don't see purpose as a fact in the world that we can discern. And I have no idea about how we might actually establish those kinds of facts. I do think causation is very complicated, and in retrospect, I think it's more complicated than the treatment in our book. Unfortunately, I wasn't as aware of the complexity as I am now, such that I might not have ever finished the book. But I think in many, many areas we can talk about causation, and do. typically talk about causation, and properly do, in morally neutral terms. And we can distinguish between the question whether something causes death and whether that causing of death is justified. I think those are completely separate issues. But in traditional medical ethics, it's just been, there's been this fixation on it is always wrong for a clinician to kill the patient. And it just doesn't jive with, I think, a reasonable understanding of actual practice.
Okay, one more before we get kicked out, please.
I want to thank you for a great panel. I'm not a philosopher or a physician, and I'm an English professor, which means I'm probably a bad philosopher. But I wanted to ask a question about organ donation, because it seems to me that the practice of organ donation actually pushes the envelope on, or explains something to me. And so one of the things that I've become more increasingly disturbed about organ donation as a kind of routine practice that defines how we think of, like, when someone's suffering from kidney disease, we often say the person needs a kidney. We don't say they're dying of kidney failure, we say they need a kidney. And so that technological practice of organ donation has actually transformed our understanding of the body, and it seems to confirm, so this is my question, it seems to confirm the notion of the body as only determined by efficient causation, because if my organs really, when my brain no longer functions, my organs are only meaningful if they go into another person's body as a kind of way to kind of keep that body working. That seems to be only an understanding of my body and its organs in terms of this notion of efficient causation. But there's no meaning to the integrity of my body once I'm technically dead, except for how those organs, you know what I mean? My organs don't mean anything to me anymore. There's no way to talk about the meaning of those organs except in terms of how they might be useful to another person. So am I right in that? And could you, I'm just fascinated with this notion of how all of you would consider organ donation in the context of the principles that you offer today.
Well, I just want to say that I am not, in any way would say that we ought not to be doing organ transplant. I would never say that. Okay, that just seems a bit off to me. However, I will say that the routinization of it, I do find a bit problematic. There were several initiatives put forward in the mid-2000s in which practices were set up such that organ procurement organizations can get into the hospital and have access to patient information even before the patient is dead. And those guidelines are still in place. So there you have organ procurement organizations going in and looking at anyone who has a Glasgow coma scale of about 5 will automatically get reviewed by someone, even though there's no indication that they're going to die or that they're dead. So those kind of practices lead to some and then there are the initiatives, the business management initiatives. You have effective requesters and people who are very highly successful at convincing people to donate the organs of their loved one. It makes me a little uncomfortable. It makes me feel a little creepy about it. And again, I'm not arguing against organ donation. I'm just saying, the drive towards efficiency and effectiveness leads to this kind of creepiness that goes on. 8 organs every time. They've got these little mantras that are out there, and organ procurement people would probably want to hang me as well for pointing this out. But it's almost as if the only value of your body is insofar as it can serve as a source of power for another person who's living, which means their brain is functioning, right? And I think that is problematic as well. So I think we just need to start thinking about the way we put these practices into our social apparatuses, right? That lead to us doing this, because it does lead to some creepiness and some conundrums. The living bodies of the dead are used as resources for the dead bodies of the living. It's just this weird way we talk about, that we use language to, it leads to these absurdities and conundrums that we can't get out of. And I worry that by making them efficient and effective, we're kind of going on down a pathway that we become, parasitic upon one another.
Thank you very much.